Today we're going to be talking about evolution. The idea of evolution was discovered or described by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace in the mid-1800s. Charles Darwin receives most of the credit because he wrote the book On the Origin of Species, but Alfred Russel Wallace was also a big component of that. Evolution was pretty clearly described by Charles Darwin when he drew out a phylogeny. You can see this phylogeny here, which describes how he hypothesized how evolution worked and how species changed over time. We'll talk more about phylogenies later. The central idea in evolution, as described by Darwin and Wallace, is that species change over time. That species are not static, but rather they will evolve and change and adapt to their environments as time goes on. And this also produces more species and increases biodiversity. Now, today we describe evolution as a change in allele frequency over time. Now, remember, on each DNA strand are huge numbers of genes, and different variants of a single gene are called alleles. For example, a blue-eyed gene versus a brown-eyed gene, or red-hair gene versus a blonde-hair gene. Now, different genes have different numbers of alleles, and those alleles can be highly variable. And you can see them denoted here in the DNA double helixes here as colors. So in generation 1, we have a gene, doesn't matter what gene it is, and we have two alleles, a red one and a blue one. Over time, as allele frequencies change due to evolution for a variety of reasons, the frequency of different alleles change. For example, in generation 2, we have a yellow and blue allele. In generation 3, we have pink and yellow. And then in generation 4, we have two pink alleles. And so change in allele frequency is the definition of evolution as we use it today. Now, evolution acts on what we call genetic variation. That is the number of different alleles within a population that arise through mutations. And mutations is just an alteration to the genetic code, that A, T, C, G sequence of DNA. And a mutation is simply a bad copy or an incorrect copy of the DNA sequence. Mutations can be a variety of things. They can be completely meaningless. They can be very harmful. They can also be beneficial. And the way mutations work is by altering the proteins. So the central dogma of biology is that we go from DNA to RNA to proteins. And so genetic variation that alters proteins will then alter the phenotype and alter the individual. So for example, you can see here in the main DNA sequence, we have a pink protein there, which is illustrated by that little pink swirly. And then the first set of mutations, we have one allele change, and the protein didn't change at all. So it's not going to really affect the individual that much. In the second set of mutations, we have multiple mutations in there, and you can see that the color of the protein has changed. So there's some visible or detectable effect of those mutations. And as we go down through mutation sets 3 and 4, we get an increasing number of mutations that deviated further and further from the original genetic sequence, and the protein has changed more different, or is now more different from the original than the previous sets of mutations. And so evolution can act on this genetic variation and result in changes in allele frequencies over time, resulting in changes in species. Now, there's different types of evolution. And we're just going to introduce the two basic types in this video. The first one is genetic drift. So genetic drift is really just random evolution. Evolution that isn't guided by a selective process. You've probably heard the idea of the fittest will survive, or survival of the fittest. That is not genetic drift. Genetic drift is random evolution. Now, this can happen for a variety of reasons. It could just be random sampling during the mating process based on random sampling of the genetics. It could also be due to random environmental hazards that changes the allele frequency of a population. For example, you can see this population of beetles on a branch. What would happen if, say, a kid just randomly threw a rock and hit the branch and killed some of those beetles? whether or not the beetles got hit by the rock are not related to their genetics. You can see there's two types of beetles there, the patternless ones and the dotted ones. And whether or not they're patterned or dotted or non-patterned doesn't affect their survival or likelihood of being hit by the rock in any way. Thus, if a kid threw the rock and it killed several of the patternless beetles, say 3 or 4 of the patternless beetles here, you would then have a proportionate higher frequency of dotted beetles than you did patternless beetles. And then the allele frequency of the population has changed. And that population won't be the same as it was prior to the impact of the rock. The same thing can happen with big wildfires like we get in the Sierra Nevadas, tsunamis, earthquakes, drought. It can happen with a lot of different things, but the genetic drift is just random changes in the population, so not due to a selection on the genetic composition of the individuals. Now, that's different than evolution driven by selection. So this is non-random changes in allele frequency. This is where the survival or the probability of survival or the probability of reproducing is directly related to the genetics and the variation and the phenotypes of the individuals. A good way of thinking about this is predator-prey interactions, which I've illustrated here with a bird. This bird, let's say, likes to eat a lot of beetles. And the dotted beetles have a little bit better camouflage than the patternless beetles. Thus, when the bird goes to hunt and trying to capture some beetles, it can more easily recognize the patternless beetles over the dotted beetles. And therefore, it eats more patternless beetles than it does dotted ones, which changes the population, that changes the allele frequency of the population to have more dotted beetles than patternless beetles. Now, another way of saying that is the patternless beetles are being selected against due to the predation by the bird, and the dotted beetles are being selected for because the bird is not eating those ones and eating the patternless ones. And so whether or not you survived, the beetle survived or not, was directly related to its genetics, because the genetics describe whether it's patterned as dotted or patternless. And so it's a non-random process. Now there's several different types of selection that can play out here, and we're going to talk about those in another video. So when you talk about evolution, most people think about natural selection, which is what I described with the bird here. And then a subcategory of natural selection is sexual selection, which is rather than like a predator imposing the selective pressure, it's the opposite sex. It's the ability to reproduce or not and being chosen as a mate. But we'll talk about that in the next video.